Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride's vision for the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was to provide a place of fun, happiness, and freedom. But what it turned into was a place of misery, sadness, and a prison of horrors. We left Mountville where we visited the West Virginia Penitentiary. If you didn't see that video, click the link on the screen now and watch it, or save it to watch later. You will find those stories very interesting. Then we headed to Weston, West Virginia to visit the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I found this a little interesting regarding the name. The hospital was first called the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum when construction started in 1864, but in 1913 they changed its name to Weston State Hospital because it was located in the city of Weston. The hospital was in operation until 1994, so for 130 years. However, it changed its name back to Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum to lure tourists like myself. I must admit, the name change worked on me because I was more excited to visit the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum than I know I would have felt if I was to visit the Weston State Hospital. Maybe because I feel a sense of kinship. I don't know. After walking through the halls of the lunatic asylum and hearing the stories as told by our tour guide, I understood what Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride envisioned when he first thought of making the asylum as it was, all airy and open with larger than most hospital rooms, offering its patients the best psychiatric medicine, providing a nurturing and socially interactive place for its patients, free of restraint, total independence, a caring atmosphere, just overall not subjecting its patients to horrific treatments. But I can't help but wonder why he, as a doctor looking out for his patients' health and well-being, would allow husbands or any male family member to take in their wives or any female family member for causes such as husband cheated or she cheated. Also for things like menstrual problems, depression, religious affiliation, political affiliation, and loss of appetite. Why he would condone that is beyond me. Now, a woman could not take in an adult male, but any male in the family could take in any female for any reason. For instance, a male-in-law could take a female family member and admit her to the hospital, no questions asked, and only he could have her released. She would stay there for the rest of her life if he ever died without releasing her. If a woman had children out of wedlock, a male could take that child into the asylum and hide that child from society. And if that child did not get taken out by that family member, he or she would stay there for the rest of their life. Children with Down syndrome would be taken there just because they were different or the parents did not want to have to deal with them. While we're on the subject, and there is a list at the hospital in the gift shop, here are some of the listed reasons why a woman, man, or child could be brought to the lunatic asylum, but mostly women. If a woman was illiterate, she could be admitted. If she was literate, she could be admitted. She could be accepted if she had the flu, if she was dyslexic, if she had a dog bite, the death of a son in the war, desertion by her husband, suffering from epileptic fits, there was an explosion of a shell nearby, falling from a horse, female disease, aka menstruation or menopause, fever and loss of lawsuit, greediness, laziness, loss of an arm. Oh, and this one is also a doozy. Marriage of son. So if a son got married and either he or his new wife wanted the mother's house to live in without her, they could take the mother in and have her committed at the asylum. Isn't that something? Anyway, some other reasons are mental excitement, novel reading, parents were cousins, overstudy of religion, political excitement, remorse, seduction and disappointment, severe labor, sunstroke, superstition, and there are so many more. You see this list. There was even a closed ward for disabled veterans from the Civil War just because no one else wanted to take care of them. Now let's talk a little bit about Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum's history and some of the gruesome things that happened there. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was envisioned by Dr. Story Kirkbride. Obviously, as said before, he had good intentions in making the asylum the way it is. The grounds measured 666 acres. And the buildings covered 26.5 of those acres, with a number of rooms built to enhance the recovery of its patients. It even had a working farm, a dairy herd, a water reservoir, and an ice plant because the good doctor wanted it to be as self-sufficient as possible. In 1832, Dr. Kirkbride graduated with a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania and did his residency at the Friends Asylum, a psychiatric hospital in the same state. While there, he saw how patients were nurtured and allowed to interact socially. They were not in any restraint or had to endure any barbaric treatment. He expounded on these practices and was later appointed the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in 1840. He then co-founded the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institution for the Insane, which is now the American Psychiatric Association. Having this authority, he stipulated that mental hospitals should have these necessities. It should be built on no less than 100 acres, and the building inside and out should be therapeutic to the patients, having lots of fresh air, calming aesthetic, spacious rooms, common areas for social interactions, and lots of open spaces outside. These stipulated requirements were known as the Kirkbride Plan, and this was used in the plan when constructing the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum and 72 other asylums across the USA. Plans for Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was approved in 1858 by the Virginia General Assembly, and architect Richard Snowden Andrews was contracted to oversee its construction. The first wing was built by prisoners who were not skilled workers, just free labor. During construction, blue stones were used, but they would often run out of the blue stones before the supplies would arrive. These stones were coming from 45 miles away, and more often than not, these prisoners would be sitting around idle waiting. Now, you know what they say about idle hands. So they would lose 1 to 2 convicts per day waiting for these stones, especially since no one was there to monitor them. So the state took over the construction, and the governor called for skilled workers, and they got 500 castle workers from Europe, who then decided not to wait for the blue stones, so they instead continued to build with the yellow stones, which was more readily available, and these are the stones you see more of in the construction. The first wing took the convicts 3 years to build, and the 500 skilled workers built the rest of this massive asylum in 3 years. In the end, the asylum ended up with not only this massive imposing building overlooking Weston, but with hospital wings where patients would be separated by diagnosis and treated as such. However, to backtrack here, In 1861, halfway through the construction at the outbreak of the Civil War, only the southernmost wing was completed, and the building of the asylum was put on hold. This lasted for many years. After Virginia's withdrawal from the Union, the state legislature demanded the Exchange Bank of Weston to return its unused hospital funds, which was about $30,000 of gold coins, because they wanted it to help fund the Confederate War. General George B. McClellan, the commander of the Federal forces in Wheeling, was made aware of the unused funds by some of the Virginians. He then dispatched Colonel Erastus Tyler and the 7th Ohio Volunteer Infantry to confiscate the money before it fell into rebel hands. So on June 30th, 1861, Tyler's group went to Weston and committed what is known as the Great Western Gold Robbery. They stole about $27,000 from the bank, then set up camp on the asylum grounds. Colonel Tyler shipped the gold back to Wheeling, and it was later used to finance the restored government of Virginia. After all that, the construction of the asylum was restarted and was completed in 1863. And surprise, surprise, the first 9 patients were all women. They were brought in and was admitted for, now I will state the cause and then the form of insanity as they listed them. So patient 1, acute mania. No cause was listed. Just so you understand this, the meaning of acute mania per Google means, and I quote, an extremely unstable, euphoric or irritable mood along with excessive activity or energy level, excessively rapid thought and speech, reckless behavior and feeling of invincibility. So to continue. Patient 2, cause, domestic trouble, form of insanity, dementia. Patient 3, cause, grief, form of insanity, dementia. Patient 4, cause, ill health, form of insanity, acute mania. Patient 5, dementia, no causes listed. Patient 6, cause, heredity, form of insanity, dementia. Patient 7, cause, the war, form of insanity, acute mania. Patient 8, dysmenorrhea, the medical term for painful menstrual periods, which are caused by uterine contractions. They said this form of insanity was acute mania. Patient 9, cause, ill health, form of insanity, melancholia, which is another name for melancholy. Yep, that happened, and they were all admitted on the same day, October 22nd, 1864. It wasn't until 9 years later, in 1873, that a wing was opened for colored people. The hospital was built to hold 250 patients, but due to, in large part, people being dumped there for mostly illegitimate reasons, the occupancy rose to 300% above capacity. They tried to fix this because in 1913 they restarted construction and built several auxiliary buildings such as a geriatric center, a greenhouse, a morgue, and a tuberculosis sanatorium. Then in 1949 they constructed a building for the criminally insane, as you can see here behind the main building. But that didn't help, because at its peak in the 1950s, Western State Hospital housed 2,600 people, more than 10 times the number it was intended to accommodate. Then things started to break down. The doctor-to-patient ratio got way out of hand. At one point, it went to 248 to 1. Patients became malnourished, and both the grounds and inside the hospital became unkept, leading to decaying conditions. The rooms became overcrowded, sometimes with 8 patients to a room. Many patients had to sleep in the corridor on the cold ground. Bed linens were soiled and unwashed. The furniture was broken, and the heating and air system malfunctioned often. Sometimes patients were locked up because the staff was not equipped or had the knowledge on how to care for these folks. Sometimes they even had some of the more violent patients chained to the walls or locked in cages. Then in 1949, investigative journalist Charles Armentrout published a series of reports in the Charleston Gazette detailing the poor conditions that were prevalent at the Western State Hospital. Armentrout wrote that while there he witnessed understaffed buildings, grimy common areas, and cramped patient rooms where up to 8 individuals shared a space meant for just one person. Some patients were forced to sleep on freezing hallway floors due to a lack of bedding supplies. But it was still in operation because it was reported in the papers again in 1985 that the hospital was dirty and unkept, and that patients were naked and were confined to dirty wards with bathrooms smeared with feces. Family members were discouraged from visiting and were told not to open letters sent to them from their relatives in the asylum. Now, due to what you can imagine as really poor working and living conditions, you can also imagine how frustrating it would be for the staff and the patients. Violent patients became more violent, the docile had to get violent, and even the staff had to find ways to keep safe, even resorting to unfavorable acts. Of the 900 rooms at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, only 250 were for the patients. The rest was for the doctors, nurses, and asylum workers. This was because all staff had to stay on the grounds at the hospital. They were not allowed to leave for any reason. Homesickness became a big factor, and some felt as if they were just like the patients, trapped. The asylum became a prison for both the staff and the patients. Then in 1994, when life and treatment in asylum became so bad it was no longer viable, the asylum finally closed its doors. Now, if you're a regular visitor to my channel, you know I'm going to share some of the horrible things, more horrible than that happened there. So beyond this point, viewer discretion is advised. Now, because of the overcrowding and the poor security, many atrocities were committed there. Here are some of these stories. At one point, when overcrowding got so bad, hospital administrators, out of frustration and not knowing how to best address the issue, grouped both aggressive and docile patients together. This led to one of the most horrific murders in the asylum's history. A deaf and mentally handicapped patient by the name of Charles was put in a ward with 2 vicious inmates known as Joe and Big Jim. Because of his handicap, he had the mental capacity of a small child. Charlie was very friendly and everyone loved him. He knew that and therefore thought it okay to try to make friends with everyone he met. But Joe and Big Jim was not a fan of his immature temperament and thought of him as a nuisance. On one fateful evening, Joe and Big Jim beat Charlie for his annoying behavior and tried to hang him from an overhead pipe with some bed sheets. Charlie was strung up and was left dangling. Then they would lower him several times from the makeshift noose. Charlie lost consciousness several times, but he didn't die. When the 2 saw that they could not kill him, they grabbed him, and while Big Jim held him down, Joe placed an iron bed frame on Charlie's head and jumped on it repeatedly, crushing his skull and killing him on the spot. Some of the manic patients were sometimes restrained in isolated cells or cages in common areas as staff members lacked the time or know how to appropriately deal with these behaviors. And this was an horrific scene in of itself. As said before, due to the lack of adequate supervision, there have been many instances of violent outbursts, abuse, suicide, and murder. Both patients and staff were susceptible to these horrific acts. Female attendants had to endure constant physical and sexual harassment by the hospital's most aggressive inmates. One of these assaults resulted in the murder of a nurse by an unknown assailant. Her decomposing body was found 2 months after her disappearance at the bottom of an unused stairwell. Several fires were set by pyromaniacs over the years, including one in October 1935 when one patient set fire to the 4th floor, which caused part of the roof to collapse onto the main building's south wing. The building was completely destroyed. Surprisingly, no one was hurt or killed in the fire. The damages were later repaired by the Works Progress Administration in 1938. We were not allowed to visit that wing. Then there is the body chamber. This was where they would place and store the dead bodies until their family could come and claim them. Sometimes the family never did, and these bodies were taken away to make space for the newly dead, and they were never seen again. Then there is a story of an elderly patient who planned an escape out of the ward for the criminally insane. In his attempt, he told 8 other patients about his plan, and they decided that they would escape with him. So they carried out the plan, and they did escape, but eventually the authorities did recapture the 8 escapees, but they never found the old man. It was speculated that either one or all of the 8 killed him and dumped his body, maybe because being so old he was not able to keep up and was probably slowing them down, or he was the only one that succeeded in the escape. That is why the state of West Virginia still has him at large and harmed and dangerous, even though he would be about 130 years old by now. Now, this story, we did not get a lot of information, but it was said that a patient was stabbed 17 times in the hospital by another patient. But yes, that's all the information I got. And the tour guide also told the story of a patient killing 11 other patients before they caught up to him. And in another instance, there is a story of a teenage patient killing 5 small children before they found out and stopped him. It is no doubt that the nurses and doctors would also be frustrated and would do some sketchy things to curb the patients who misbehaved, like in this story. The male patients in the male ward were all allowed to smoke, and if at any time one of these patients would cause harm to any of the staff members, the rest of the ward would not be allowed to get their daily smokes. Withdrawal would cause some to get very wild. So, what the staff would do is wait a few days to a week when the smokers would really get manic. Then they would take them to a small room. They would light and give only 1 cigarette to the patient who had caused the harm and leave him inside that room with the rest of them. I leave the rest to your imagination as to what you think would happen to him. But if you can't imagine, often that patient would not leave that room alive. When the overcrowding got to its peak, many treatments were implemented to fix the insane, like electroconvulsive shock therapy, contrast bath. This is where a limb or the entire body is immersed in hot water, followed by the immediate immersion of the limb or body in icy water. This procedure is repeated several times, alternating hot and cold. Wow. Then there is the forced sterilization to cut down on the number of babies being born in the asylum. However, the worst one was the transorbital lobotomies, performed or supervised by Dr. Walter Jackson Freeman II, the infamous neurologist who popularized the crude ice pick technique in America from 1948 to 1952, when the asylum participated in the West Virginia lobotomy project, aka Operation Ice Pick. They would do this to fix these violent patients as well as the docile ones. Unlike traditional prefrontal lobotomies, which involved drilling through the skull. The ice pick lobotomy was done by placing a slender surgical instrument made from high-quality surgical steel into the corner of each eye socket, then striking the instrument with a mallet in order to break through the eye socket. The rod was then moved in a methodical sequence to sever the connective tissues in the brain's prefrontal cortex. While Dr. Freeman had no formal surgical training, he performed or directly supervised 775 lobotomies across 5 West Virginia mental institutions, 70 of which were at Western State Hospital. Dr. Freeman hailed the treatment, claiming how successful it was, but he was lying, because this procedure was severely debilitating many previously healthy individuals. After procedure, they were now afflicted with lifelong cognitive and physical deficits and were left so mentally messed up that they now required constant care for even their basic functional needs. Even at the start, 4 Western patients died due to complications resulting from their lobotomies. Dr. Freeman continued to perform transorbital lobotomies well into the 1960s, inflicting immeasurable amount of pain and suffering on thousands of individuals. He even performed a prefrontal lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy, which was ordered by her father, Joe Kennedy, because he wanted to ease her emotional outbursts. But like most of the other patients, the surgery left her mentally and physically incapacitated for the rest of her life. Even after the arrival of the psychotropic drug chlorpromazine in the 1950s, aka Thorazine, which was the first antipsychotic drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1954, referred to as the chemical lobotomy. Thorazine sedated excitable symptoms of psychosis with few adverse effects, rendering surgical lobotomies impractical. Dr. Freeman still continued to perform up to 3,500 more lobotomies nationwide, all the way up into the 1960s, and roughly 14% of his victims died from the procedure. He was finally banned from operating in 1967 after one of his long-term patients died from a brain hemorrhage following her 3rd lobotomy by Dr. Freeman. Dr. Freeman later died of complications arising from an operation for his cancer on May 31st, 1972. Due to the lack of proper care and access to sanitation, which led to a number of deaths at the asylum, and the lobotomies carried out by Dr. Freeman, no one knows how many people died at the asylum. The tour guide said it got so bad that they were running out of spots to bury them. They were even giving away bodies to the university using medical training, also giving cadavers to one man to practice mummification. Across Trans-Allegheny's 130-year existence as an operative mental institution, an estimated 30,000 people died within its walls. Untold thousands are buried in unmarked graves on the hill overlooking the asylum. The state of West Virginia attempted to exhume and identify the bodies, but this endeavor was discontinued after 4,000 sets of remains were found, spanning over 3 cemeteries. Only a few of the headstones in the cemetery have names on them. Most people only got a numbered brick. On January 26, 1986, West Virginia Governor Arch Moore announced that Western State Hospital had lost its distinction as a mental institution. So, for several years, the building was used as a prison, while a new psychiatric hospital was constructed across town. Western citizens were upset with the closure of the asylum, which had been a major employer and community unifier for generations. Despite numerous protests, the hospital permanently closed in 1994 and was left abandoned for over a decade. One man who had spent 60 years of his life in the facility was in tears when he found out the building had to be closed. The patient didn't want to leave his home. He died a few weeks later. Then, in the final destruction before the asylum was auctioned off back in 1999, all 4 floors of the interior of the building were damaged by several city and county police officers who went from floor to floor shooting paintballs, further damaging the decaying building. 3 of the officers were dismissed because of this. Many plans were made for the building over the years. Project developers wanted to turn the former asylum into a hotel and spa and even a hospital, but all of these plans fell through. Then in 2000, a museum about the American Civil War was opened inside the building, but it was closed shortly after because where they were located in the building, it was deemed a fire hazard. Then in 2007, the former asylum was bought by a businessman named Joe Jordan for $1.5 million. A year later, in 2008, he started removing the building's asbestos, which was something he knew how to do, doing his best to maintain the historic architecture. But renovating the entire building was proving to be very expensive, something his budget could not handle. So his daughter Rebecca Jordan Gleason decided to make money by organizing concerts, holding meetings, dinner shows, historic tours, and ghost tours, because they say the building is extremely haunted. This is how, and still is how, they are generating money for the renovation for the building, and are still doing so to this day.
We're at Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, and more importantly, this one's a cool fact. The actual plot of land it's on is 666 acres with 13 buildings.
One of the fascinating things, though, about this property is this 300-year-old tree. It has endured through the years, even getting struck by lightning, but it still stands tall on the lawn of the asylum. Well, folks, that is the story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. If you liked any part of this story, well, you won't like the story, but if you like that I told you this story, okay, I guess you might not be happy that I told you this story. But if you like the way I told the story, yes. If you like the way I told this story, then give this video a like and share it with someone whom you think will like it as well. And do subscribe for more if you want to come with me on the next one. Anyway, be good, and if you can't be good, be careful, and look out for my weekly uploads. Love you. Bye.